Hey, Bright Lights, welcome to Architecting. I am so excited today to have as my guest my friend Roderic Walton. He is a principal at Moody Nolan, where he's in charge of EDI. He's also president-elect of the AIA Academy of Architecture for Health, and he currently serves on the Academy as chair of the Education Committee. So I've known him for a number of years. We've had lots of conversations around equity in healthcare and evidence-based design as it relates to equity issues in healthcare. And I'm really excited to have him on today to talk about his latest project, the RKW Architecture Lens. So welcome, Rod.
Thank you for having me, Angela. I'm thrilled to be here.
So, first of all, let's explain to everybody what the architectural lens is and why you decided to take this on. You clearly already got a lot on your plate, but this is an independent project that you've chosen to do.
Yeah, so the RKW Architectural Lens is a special project for me, and it was really born out of questions that I was getting from a lot of folks, family members, other people I know who aren't architects, who don't touch the architecture space about what architecture is and why it's important, and frankly, why they should care about it. And so the channel is for anyone who is curious about architectural design and who has ever wondered about how the environments that we all navigate our home, our neighborhoods, our workplace, if you have kids where your kids go to school, how do those environments come about? How do the environments that we experience from a sensory perspective, an emotional perspective, how do they come about? Who shapes them? What is the role of the people who shape them? And what's our collective responsibility to shape them with intent and some forethought about the impact on the people who will use it, in some cases for decades?
Yeah, I love that you said that because I think we all get a little brainwashed when we go through architecture school because I noticed it anyway. There was a moment where I realized the way I saw the world had forever changed, and I was never going to go back to seeing the world the way I did before. And as a result, I think, though, that we can forget that people don't see the world the way we see it. And all these things we care about, all these things we believe that we know design has the power to do, they don't understand that. So they don't value design. They view it as functional or aesthetic when it's so much more than that.
It's a lot more than that. So what the channel talks about is the relationship between design, education, and the future of architecture. And so I'm interviewing a lot of folks who touch the architectural space, who might, who your viewers might find more familiar. So teachers, for example, my spouse is a teacher. Teachers touch the educational space and they inhabit architecture in very special and meaningful ways. And so there's an affinity between education and architecture and the way that people can learn about their environments that people find relatable. My experience with trying to talk about architecture to people who don't do this professionally is they're kind of it's not a very engaging topic on the surface, and people's eyes kind of glaze over when you start talking about architecture through an academic lens. So the channel's purpose and the reason that it exists is to make architecture more engaging and to present it through lenses that people can relate to. I really believe that architecture has become a social art form now. It used to be where architecture was represented through these really unique voices. Frank Lloyd Wright and others would kind of establish what architecture was for the masses. Architecture is a social art form now. It's much more diverse. There's a lot more voices involved. It's literally a social construct now because we're talking about it on a social media platform. And it can be much more approachable for your everyday person if you explain it through a lens that they can understand. And so my channel adopts three lenses: define, find, and interpret. Define is about understanding the intent behind the decisions that we make as architects. Find is about finding the evidence that supports those decisions. And then interpret is about applying that knowledge to understand what shapes the world around us. And so by breaking it down into simple terms and finding relatable ways to talk about it, I think that we can make this conversation exciting and engaging and invite a lot more people into the conversation than would normally be talking about an architectural topic.
Yeah, and I've been really interested lately in this idea of co-creation in design, which is different than just bringing in a focus group or having a community listening session, but actually having the people who will be using the space actively working with you side by side to design the space. So I was wondering where you see co-design in terms of a trend, a movement, something that is really going to leave an indelible mark on the way we practice and why or why not that might happen.
I love this question. It's really about being able to explain and in some cases interrogate the role of the architect. I do a lot of community engagement work and bringing the community into the design process and explaining it from their perspective. What is the benefit for them? Why should we program around their needs and their best interests? The worst outcome I think we can have as architects is that we can approach a new project with a preconceived notion about how it should be programmed and what the outcome should be. I'm working on a couple of projects now where we invite the community to come in and tell us exactly what services they need and participate in those early programming conversations. And it's just so much more rewarding because they'll illuminate opportunities for the community that aren't always front of mind for an architect. So, for example, if I'm designing a healthcare space, I might be thinking about exam rooms and throughput and how many visits can I get in that exam room in an hour. And I ask the community members, what is top of mind for you? And they might say, well, I need to have a daycare space so that I can get to the appointment and not have to worry about where my kids are. Or I might want to come to that appointment and do a workout after my exam or have a healthy smoothie after my exam. And wouldn't it be great if I could do all those things, drop my kids off, have my exam, get a quick workout in, get a smoothie, and pick my kids up, and I never left that building. That's not something that an architect would typically walk into a meeting expecting to hear. But when you hear it, that light bulb goes off, and you can start to think of projects through a new and exciting lens that is really not how we would typically be trained to think about it. We're typically trained to solve a very specific set of problems that are identified by a client, not an end user. And so this narrow lens that we typically operate in can be expanded. And part of what the channel does is invites us to go on that journey and really have an open mind about what a project can be from the onset.
So how do we overcome the typical resistance we get, though our client is the one paying for the project, who has to operate the facility, who may be resistant to what they're hearing from the community? What's the business case for why these more uncommon things should be included?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's about making the business case from the perspective of the end user, which is the patient. And so if you think about preventative healthcare, for example, making the business case that you can operationalize a model on preventative healthcare and keep folks healthy, that means that you're keeping them from burdening the system in other ways. So for example, if you design an environment where preventative healthcare and whole person health is the focus, it means that you can detect diseases earlier. You can prevent those diseases that are more advanced from becoming so problematic that a person has to approach the ED environment, for example, and using the ED as their primary care facility, which it is never designed to handle. It becomes overwhelmed. Your stress level for your staff, they start to experience burnout. The financial and operational model for that emergency department that is now overwhelmed is failing. And so by taking a step back and saying, how can we meet our stakeholders where they are, keep them healthier, keep them from overwhelming a system that is not designed to provide them from the most optimal care, you can kind of reach into a C-suite owner's mind and kind of reverse engineer that model and help them kind of come to the conclusion that, yeah, it actually does make financial sense to invest in preventive health care in order to make sure that the entire system, the entire spectrum of care remains sustainable.
I think that is so important. And it starts with kind of this grassroots of knowing what people want and then making them feel empowered that you really are going to listen to what they have to say. They really do have agency, that their concerns really are going to be addressed, as well as why that's going to be financially a good thing. It's not part of the first cost, though, right? And that's kind of like where our gears get stuck as architects is it's not a first cost issue, it's a value proposition.
That's so true. It's not a first cost issue. It is a value proposition. And so one of the things that we think about, that I think about, is what is the role of the architect? We're supposed to be a trusted advisor, right? We present this value proposition. I like to call it actionable idealism. And so when we're thinking about this concept of equity and representation and really the legibility of our craft, how do we make our processes transparent and legible to a C-suite owner, to a staff member, to a physician, to a community member, so they can kind of peel back some of the layers of what we would normally think of as the kind of step-by-step process, and in some cases reimagine it. I know that healthcare is kind of risk averse on the surface. People like to follow a protocol that has been proven to work in the past, and there's not a whole lot of appetite for being a maverick, right? However, if you can prove that the evidence-based process has been followed to suggest a new and novel idea, and if you can use this concept of actionable idealism to position the architect at the forefront of an inflection point for a new idea, as long as it's evidence-based, I feel like a lot of clients will at least be open-minded and receptive to maybe considering something unique and maybe novel. It doesn't mean that at the end of the day they're going to elect that option, but I think if you can make an evidence-based case for it as an advocate who is embracing a new ideal or a new paradigm that can kind of shift the focus to more closely align with what a healthcare customer might be looking for, especially one who's coming from a vulnerable population, I think there's value there that is noteworthy.
It's really a role of being a convener because what you're talking about is you're working both ends of the spectrum. We have our normal place and the people we deal with that represent the client, but you're talking about going upstream of them so that you're talking about the value to the organization as a whole, but also downstream and starting to build demand and momentum so that now the people that they serve are starting to ask for this. So now it starts to also have value in terms of meeting patient slash customer service demands.
That's exactly right. It's really about everyday architecture. So it's about finding spaces to reflect on neighborhood needs, neighborhood engagement, thinking about generational families who have structures where you have the grandparents, the parents, the kids, maybe the grandkids, all kind of living under one roof and really looking at opportunities to reflect the everyday real experiences of patient populations and trying to marry that or pair that with the expectations from a C-suite. And so there's got to be this middle ground where our end customer, who is ultimately the patient, has just as much of a say in the final product as our actual client. The the important thing there is that it takes participation and a recognition from the client to acknowledge that there should be some parity there. A lot of times we find that we feel like we're the authoritative voices in the room, that the architect and the client are the authoritative voices in the room, when actually there's a third voice there that is often missed, and that's the neighborhood stakeholders representing the everyday life of a patient.
Yeah, and I think that happens because there's a lot of assumptions made about is what we think people want or what we think they need as if we know better than them. But then there's also, they don't have the language. The average person who could be a patient doesn't always know what they can ask for or what they should ask for. So they aren't always being the best advocate for themselves because they just don't know how. They don't know how to
Yeah.
get in.
It's true. They don't know the lexicon, but they do know exactly what they need. And this is where the concept of the advocate architect on the channel becomes so important. Because if you ask a patient who doesn't have any healthcare background to explain what they need in a healthcare lens, you're right. They're not going to have the tools and lexicon. But if you step back and you say, what do you need? What would make your healthcare experience better? What are some of the barriers to access? When you have a healthcare need, what do you worry about? They can absolutely articulate that in a way that is very clear and direct. And I feel like it's our job as the architects with healthcare experience and expertise to take what we're hearing and translate it into a healthcare lexicon that our C-suite and our healthcare stakeholders can then start to interpret and refine. So we become the bridge and the really the glue, if you will, that helps make that communication pipeline sustainable and viable.
So this is one really great service you're providing through this channel is creating that ability, that pipeline for architects to see themselves in an expanded role and how to do that. Because a lot
Right.
of times the first thing we think about is, but I can't do that. No one's going to let me do that. And so you're starting to show ways you don't have to ask permission, ways you can just be that advocate for change, that catalyst, that convener. And that is really important because otherwise, what are we here for? What are we doing? We're not actually making anybody's lives better. We're just frustrating ourselves as well.
I think that's right. And I think clients respond positively when they see an architect taking the initiative to do something that is exemplary of the profession. A lot of our healthcare clients are architects by training. I'd say about 50% of the clients that I work with who are leading healthcare projects are licensed architects or have an architectural background. So they understand some of the stakes and they understand what some of the typical constraints are because they went through the same training that you and I did. And so when they see someone who can take that traditional lens and focus and reshape it and reimagine it, I don't get a whole lot of resistance to the initial idea of listening. And again, it doesn't always mean that at the end of the day they're going to say yes, but they often appreciate a cogent, well expressed perspective that is based on research and data, and they welcome new ideas and will often consider them and consider them seriously.
Which, the answer is always no if you don't ask, right? So
Exactly.
we have to put it out there. And even though sometimes it can feel like more is a no than a yes,
Hmm.
even if you only get 5% yes, you moved the bar 5%. And if you keep moving the bar 5% and everybody else in the industry keeps moving the bar, eventually we're going to get there, right?
It's so true. You're not going to move the needle if you don't ask. And I think back so many projects when we started out the beginning of the project, it seemed like a daunting task to do the things that you and I have been talking about. But at the end of the day, it's so rewarding. I apologize for the dog barking in the background. At the end of the day, it's so rewarding to look back and say, wow, we actually pulled it off. We accomplished something that no one thought we could. There was a partnership and a shared mission and vision. And you know what? We pulled it off. And most importantly, when you look back at the data and you do the post-occupancy evaluation, it's working. It's having the impact that we had hoped for. That's the best part. When you can see that it's actually keeping people healthier, it's actually reducing anxiety, it's actually focusing on whole person health, actually has a payoff at the end. That's the best reward that you could hope for as an architect, is to see not only was the idea embraced, but it's actually having a substantive impact that you can prove through the data.
right? So when we dare to do something different, when we take those risks, when we are advocates, we show what's possible. But I also want to explore another dimension of what you are doing with this channel in terms of showing what's possible, and that is the career path of architect.
The career path is probably the question I get the most, Angela, from emerging professionals. Architecture kind of has a bad rap in terms of the length of time it takes from your initial days as an emerging professional through licensure, through getting a leadership position that is substantive and that pays well. There's a long arc in architecture that is longer than any of our tangent fields, such as, real estate or development or construction management. You can get to a leadership position a lot faster in those industries than you can in ours. And so the question I get is why should I stick with it? Why should I stay? And this concept of sustained presence is something that the channel leans in on. What is the value of an emerging professional having a sustained presence and sticking with this for 30 years, 40 years, or more? And it really comes down to identifying very early in your profession what you want that impact to be. And so I will challenge my mentees to kind of state in a couple of sentences, how do you want to use your platform to change the profession? And what impact do you want to have at the end of your career? And if you can answer that question, it's not normally about the money, it's not normally about the title. Typically, that answer is about, I want to make a change. I want to make someone's life better through my craft. And if you can keep that as your North Star, then you can have some patience to kind of weather the kind of slow burn that it takes to get that next promotion or to get that next raise, because you're not just doing it for reasons that are internal. You're doing it because you recognize that there are people who actually would benefit and who actually need your voice and need your presence to reflect what their internal struggles are, what their hopes and dreams are. Because architecture is not just about building structures, right? It's about building hope. It's about building spaces where people can live, where they can learn, where they can heal, where they can dream, all while being safe and secure. And if that's your primary focus and you can keep building on that legacy, it makes everything else make sense.
Yeah, it it's really an aspirational career, but sometimes to stay aspirational, you can't just count on the projects you get. We talked a little bit about how you can push the envelope in your projects, but we also said, you could push, but you're maybe going to get 5% of that. So you have to look at your career beyond just the scale of the project. So I always talk about the scale of the firm, what initiatives can you get involved in, and you know that well, but also the scale of the industry and why, no matter where you are in your career, you really need to be looking beyond just the scale of the projects to have that impact.
It's really true because if you have a very narrow view of the profession, you will be disillusioned and you'll be tempted because you'll probably have friends or someone else you know who is progressing faster in one of those tangent industries that we talked about. So it's really hard to have a long view of the profession as a 20-something architect starting out. I didn't have that view, but looking back, in hindsight, it would have helped me to kind of think about that this kind of proposition, right, that you can have an impact that is endurable and lasting, and you can look back over the course of a career and say, wow, I did it. I changed specific people's lives and made their lives better. And that's been the reward for me personally as I look back through a 30-year career. It wasn't always a fast trajectory, but it was a meaningful one. And that provides me with a lot of comfort.
Yeah, we're like the OG over here, but
That's
I think,
right.
we're both fellows. And as you know, that is a process where you really do have to connect the dots and look for the receipts from everything you've ever done. And it's actually a very beautiful process because when you do that, you start to see how that person who started off in architecture school with stars in their eyes really did have a vision and that there really is a through line. It might not have taken you where you thought it would, but that, yeah, I really can see that the things I was passionate about, I never stopped looking for ways to show up for those, for learning about those. And the cumulative effect of that is what brought me to this point.
I'm so glad that you mentioned the fellowship because you're right. Just kind of looking back over my career, and I get into this a little bit on the channel. A lot of my professors were telling me that I wasn't going to make it in the industry and were actually discouraging me from continuing. It was really difficult to understand how to continue because I was really struggling with my identity and trying to chart my own path in the profession. But what I realized, and what I talk about in the video, is that there's something about someone telling you that you can't do something that makes you want to try even harder. And so it actually had the opposite impact and the opposite effect of what they had planned, which was it made me dig in my heels and want to stay in the profession and want to chart a course that would, allow me to sustain my presence. And so I had to do that. And the thing about the fellowship is it really makes you, as you were saying, connect all of these dots that didn't quite make sense, but understanding how to overcome negative influences, how to persevere, how to craft a story that is unique and personal and that touches the lives of the people around you. Because as your listeners may not know this, but part of the fellowship submission requires you to identify what's called the ripple effect. How has your work impacted the lives and the careers of those around you? And so it really forces you to kind of look back holistically at your impact. And man, if I had given up, not only would it not have helped me, but it wouldn't have benefited all the people who've been touched by the work that we do. And so that's why it's so important to really think about sticking with it and trying to have that sustained path and not letting negative influences become a deterrent.
That's such great advice because it's easy, I think, when we know the way the story ends to discount what it took in those moments of truth when we weren't sure. And I love that you're saying, dig in. Don't take that setback as the clue that you're going the wrong way, but rather more of a test of how much do you want it.
It really is. It's a litmus test of how hard you're willing to work for it. How much do you want it? Unfortunately, it's not an easy path for a lot of people. There are a lot of people who don't have a clear through line from the start to finish in their career. What I mean by that is that, a lot of folks get advanced in the career in architecture specifically because there's a high level manager who looks at them and sees themselves reflected, right? Oh, you remind me of myself when I was your age. You remind me of my son at your age. My problem is when those high level managers looked at me, I didn't remind them of anyone who was familiar. As a matter of fact, when they looked at me, they didn't see anything that they could relate to or recognize. And so my challenge or my path was much harder because I had to just kind of chart my own journey and navigate a path that wasn't as easy as some of my peers in the industry had.
And I think that gets overlooked a lot when we look at why are there not more women in the profession or more minorities in the profession, but we don't understand the additional burden that those people have that just is one more drain on their energy, on their enthusiasm, and they have to work that much harder. And not everybody's in a place to always put that much effort in.
It's true. And so the channel starts to unpack this a little bit by forcing us to understand the why and the why behind what the value proposition of architecture is and why stick with it, because you're right, it is a harder path. The numbers and the statistics about diversity in the profession are stagnant. They're not moving like other industries are, like the medical profession, the legal profession. We're kind of stuck in this loop where we're just not getting more diverse than we were 10 years ago, 15 years ago. The numbers are kind of inching up for some groups, but not for everyone. And that's the reason why it's like we don't really self-assess a lot. A lot of these topics are taboo topics that we don't even talk about. It's not considered politically correct to even have conversations like this in the workplace. And we're certainly not going to change it if we can't talk about it, which is why I'm so glad that you have this platform where we can have very candid conversations and identify solutions.
Yeah, a mentor of mine used to use the phrase, if you can see it, you can be it. And she would also say, we reach for the highest branch we can see. And what we don't always realize while we're in the struggle of it all and feeling discouraged or being angry or frustrated is that every time we take a step forward, every time we show up, every time we follow our dream, like you were saying, it is a profession of aspiration and idealism and knowing that you have the ability to truly impact people's lives for the positive. And every time we do that, no matter how much it took to do it, we're showing somebody else what's possible.
It's so true. I think of architecture as a conversation between generations, a conversation between eras. And so we're talking about exploring this concept that we can bridge the gap between generations through our craft, right? So we can look at this a couple of different ways, Angela. You can look back on your own career and kind of see yourself progressing as we've been talking about and maturing. That's our own conversation between eras, is our own personal journey from our younger selves to now. But you can also fast forward it and say, I want to have a conversation with that next generation and kind of pay it forward. And so this concept of architecture being this vehicle, this conversation, this bridge between eras, a bridge between generations is something that I find very fascinating. And it keeps me wanting to push past all of the disappointment, all of the challenges, all of the barriers that we've been talking about. Why would you stick with it when there's an easier path somewhere else? Well, it's because you have hope that you can impact someone else and impact someone else's journey and kind of gradually build a pipeline of people who represent and reflect the communities that they work in and serve in.
Yeah. And just to kind of wrap up with that sentiment, what do you think are the challenges that someone who's maybe in their last years of high school right now and thinking about architecture as a career, or maybe in school or just starting as a professional, what are they facing that is maybe easier or harder than what you faced back when you were in that position?
I think the main thing that they're facing is just there's a lot of unknowns. I think the concept of architecture and what an architect actually does is not very well understood at that level. And this is why the channel is important as an instructional tool, because they may be thinking about architecture as a career path, but not really understanding the difference between architecture and engineering, the difference between architecture and construction. And so there's a passion, but it's not a passion that's informed by a vision of what they're really getting into. And what I hear from a lot of students at that age is that I love architecture, but I'm not good at math. I don't think I can do it. Or I love architecture, but I'm not good at fill in the blank. So I don't see myself, excelling in it. And I think what we can do and what the channel can do is kind of lift the veil and say that there is no such thing as a perfect architect who's good at everything. And being passionate can get you far enough that you can fill in the rest of your skill set and learn the rest of the craft. And so I think the biggest burden is just not having enough confidence to think that you can do it. And the channel is designed to give students that confidence and become a bridge to, I don't think I can, to wow, if that guy did it or if that gal did it, I can do it too. And it's really designed to be an encouraging tool to get people to see themselves succeeding. Because it's more of a psychological block than anything. Can that student see themselves succeeding in the industry? Hopefully, after watching the channel, the answer will be yes, they absolutely can.
That is tremendous and so needed. That and step two, which is get your license. That is my
Yes,
soapbox.
absolutely.
Why do you say it's important to get your license?
It's important for a couple of reasons. The main reason to become licensed is that you want to be able to say, I have this tool, this license that enables me to practice architecture without any type of a ceiling, right? Without a license, you're going to eventually get to the point in your career where you've got this boundary, this ceiling where you're still growing, you're still learning, you're still evolving, but because you don't have the license, your career path is not evolving at the same rate that you are as a professional. And so by getting a license, it lifts that boundary or that barrier so that now your growth potential is unlimited. And now there's parity between your personal growth and your career growth. And really there's no limit to what you can accomplish once you have that tool, that license in place. And so what I see is a lot of folks are struggling with this concept of should I go for it? Should I get licensed? Should I do it? And my answer is there's really no reason not to do it. There's lots of incentives to do it and not really a good reason not to. And so I feel like just explaining that trajectory and the parity between personal growth and professional development, I can kind of see people think about that and say, yeah, that makes sense. I don't want to get to the point where I'm limited in what I can achieve.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that insight. And thank you for creating this channel. I think everyone listening can hear the passion in your voice, even though you are a very even-tempered, soft-spoken person. That passion is bursting through. And clearly, this is a labor of love for you because you are so committed to raising awareness for everyone about the power of design and why we need good design, but also empowering more people to be architects and architects to feel they have more agency. So, all clearly very, very big gaps in our collective consciousness. So, thank you for taking on this big challenge.
Yeah, this is my passion, Angela, and thank you for the invitation to share it with you and your viewers and listeners.
So if people would like to follow up or like to listen to the RKW architectural lens, how can they do that?
Yeah, you just go to YouTube and you search for the RKW Architectural Lens. It'll come right up, and be sure to like and subscribe and just help us grow. Tell us in the comments what you want to see us cover so that we can become the channel that you want to watch and support.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again for being such a great guest, and I look forward to seeing what's next on the architecture lens.
Thank you, Angela.